Good morning and welcome to the second and last day of the US EPA Grant Writing Strategies Workshop for Ohio. I'm Roxanne Anderson, the KSU Technical Assistance to Brownfields Regional Director for US EPA Region 5. I'm joined today by our speakers, Dan Cholker, the lead Brownfields Coordinator with the Ohio EPA, Riley Jenkins from Region 5 US EPA, Beth Grigsby, Assistant Director with KSU TAB for US EPA Region 5, and KSU TAB partner, Amy Yursevich. We are also joined by our panel members, Carla Ocker from the US EPA Region 5, Sally Gladwell, Senior Vice President, Senior Principal with the Manikin Smith Group, Melissa Zoller, Planning Director, and Kate Dunn, Senior Planner from Buckeye Hills Regional Council. We're thrilled to have you all joining us today, and we've got an exciting morning lined up for you once again. As I went over yesterday, if you have technical difficulties with your connection, please call 785-200-7005 or email chsr@ksu.edu, and someone should be able to assist you. We are recording this workshop today, and the recording along with the presentation slides will be available on the KSU TAB website where you registered for this event within the next few days or the beginning of next week. That link will be shared in the chat box. Some additional reminders from yesterday: all participants are automatically muted and your videos are turned off. We would like for this session to be as interactive as possible, so we do encourage you to ask your questions throughout the event today using the chat feature located in the Zoom toolbar. To make sure we're able to verify your attendance, please change your participant name if you have not already done so to match your name you used for registration. You can do this by clicking on the participants icon, also on the Zoom bar. When the list of participants comes up, you can locate yourself, click on the More button, and select Rename, and a new box should appear asking you to enter a new screen name. For those of you who missed yesterday and are not familiar with KSU TAB, we are one of 6 technical assistance programs in the United States funded by a US EPA grant. The TAB service providers provide free services that are tailored to specific needs in planning, economic development, and environmental challenges with brownfields. Kansas State University covers US EPA Regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's extremely important for us to hear from participants so we can continuously improve and keep our content relevant. A lot of you may have filled out the survey yesterday, but if you could do so again today, the survey is relevant for each day. So if you could pull this up and have it ready by the end of the session to fill it out again for your experience today, we would really appreciate that. If you do not have a copy of today's agenda, it can be found on the registration website. We have a full day starting off with the state TBA program. We will then learn how to navigate some invaluable tools to help with data gathering, and we'll round out the day with another group exercise that will go over section 3 of the grants. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our first speaker of the day, Dan Cholker.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to take this opportunity to kind of quickly go over our targeted brownfield assessment program. We mentioned it a little bit yesterday, and it'll probably come up again today a few times. And this program has been housed here at Ohio EPA for a number of years, really started around 2002. And I've looked at some of the statistics, and we've done over 600 projects since then. And actually, in the last 5 years, we've done 280 projects totaling over $5 million in grant funds that we've spent as free services for conducting assessments in local communities. And over 200 communities have been provided with these services, and we've done 73 of Ohio's 88 counties. So we've been able to cast a pretty broad net of assessments across the state. And in 2022, we received a $2 million assessment grant, and we pretty much spent all those funds down. And as we alluded to yesterday, we're probably going to be seeking another $2 million assessment grant for the state that we can spend across the entire state. And in 22 as well, we also been getting allocations of bill funding, also over $2 million. So the TBA program is fairly robust at this time. So there's lots of opportunities for us to assist and partner with local communities to access these funds. And our assessments have more recently been used to assist with gas station program funding. Band to gas stations, we've done over 50 assessments for getting projects into that fund. That has sunset, but they've moved a lot of those projects now into the remediation side of Department of Development's grant funding. And so in this past year or two, we've also done a lot of assessments for those projects that are looking for Department of Development funding. Next slide, please. Again, this is free services. Yeah, we're well over $1 million a year now with all the recent funding, and we do environmental assessments and planning. We have contractors already retained that perform that work, so we make it easy for the community or the applicant. It's a pretty simple application to fill out. You can find it online, and our contractors perform the work and we'll hand over a report at the end. So whether it's phase 1, phase 2, or combination thereof. Again, it's available to local governments, land banks, nonprofits can apply. It's not competitive, it's a rolling fund. Next slide. Again, eligibility for local governments and nonprofits to apply. The property cannot be under orders or on the NPL, and it has to be a brownfield, which is a very broad definition. We don't do single family homes. If it is a residential property, it needs to have at least 4 units or more, apartment type complexes, for example. The applicant does not need to own the property, and foreclosed and forfeited properties are eligible. We do a lot of due diligence type sampling, phase 1, phase 2, to help with a property transaction, for instance. So a private property owner may still own the property, but the local government is applying on their behalf. It's just that we require legal access must be provided by the property owner. And on forfeited properties, we look to the county auditor or other legal mechanisms to have that legal access obtained for those types of properties. Next slide, please. Here's just a short list of the services we provide. We've gone over these a little bit yesterday, and so phase 1, phase 2 assessments, asbestos surveys, lead-based paint surveys. Those are good for pre-demolition or pre-renovation. Geophysical surveys, we do a lot of those at the gas station properties just to make sure if we aren't aware of all the tanks, to confirm whether they're there or not. And then we do planning activities, market analysis, brownfield inventories, and vision planning. We've done more of that in the last few years because of our increased funding levels. And in more complex projects, we've moved some of these to KSU tab to help us perform those activities at various properties or areas. And US EPA also has some planning funding as well. Next slide. Our time frames, we're very busy. We try to beat these as best we can. Typically 3 to 4 months at the time of application to work complete. If we do a combination phase 1 asbestos and a phase 2, we can be pushing more like 4 to 6 months to get these projects completed. So timing is important, especially if there's a developer or some transaction that needs to occur. Starting the conversations with us early is helpful. And next slide, please. And we offer technical assistance. You can pick up the phone, talk to us anytime. We can help strategize or come up with ideas for a project and how to move forward on them. We do trainings and workshops like the one we've been on the last 2 days now. And we collaborate with the other state programs here in Ohio. Next slide, please. So here's just some links to some information and a QR code to access some of our online information, and feel free to get a hold of myself or Shelby, and we'll be happy to talk to you more about our TBA program. With that, I'll turn it over to Roxanne.
everyone. I'm Riley from US EPA, and I'm going to steal this screen to run my own slides. And if somebody could just give me a heads up if they can see that.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, my name is Riley. I'm a Brownfields project manager in Region 5. And I am here today to give you just an overview of how you can use the CGIST and EJ Screen tools to gather data and strengthen your applications for EPA Brownfields grants. Okay. So the first thing we'll go through is how Brownfields grants make environmental justice a priority. I'll discuss the basics of CGIST, do a quick walkthrough of that tool, answer any questions that are pressing at the time. Do the same for EJ Screen. We can talk about the differences between the two, and then use our new knowledge about these tools to evaluate or just quickly glance at a couple application responses. I can answer questions at the end, and I hope to save enough time, but if I don't, my contact information will be on the last slide, and these slides are available to you later. Come on. Here we go. So a critical part of EPA's Brownfields program is ensuring that residents living in communities historically affected by disinvestment, health disparities, or environmental contamination all have the opportunity to benefit from brownfields redevelopment. So this language on the screen is directly from last year's grant competition guidelines. EPA defines EJ as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Guidelines also state that applicants should be prepared to provide specific examples of how the proposed Brownfields grant project will address environmental justice concerns in Section 4E, and responses will be evaluated against the criteria in Section 5A. So the information you'll get from these two tools will support the community need and engagement section of the application. In addition to environmental justice questions, there are a couple prompts about sensitive populations, health and welfare, disease, et cetera, and those responses can also be strengthened with the information in CGIST and EJ Screen. So like I said, the community needs section is what we're going to address with these tools. For 5 points, you'll be asked to explain how funding would meet the needs of communities, specifically how they cannot source funding, other initial funding for environmental assessment, remediation, reuse, et cetera, in the target areas, because the community has a small population and or is low income. One thing to note is if you don't address the small population or low income issue in this prompt, you can get a maximum of 2 points here. Also for 5 points, identify the sensitive populations within the target area, the severity of the health or welfare issues experienced, and how this grant will address those or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the health or welfare of such groups. For 5 points again, explain how funding would address or facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the population target areas suffering from greater than normal incidence of disease or conditions possibly associated with exposure to hazardous substances, pollutants, contaminants, or petroleum. Again, maximum 2 points if you don't explain how funding would address this issue. Specifically regarding environmental justice, again, each are worth 5 points. You'll be asked to describe the EJ issues and how they affect underserved communities or disadvantaged census tracts in the target area, and then discuss how the funding would advance environmental justice and minimize displacement among the underserved communities in the target area. Please note that these directions are paraphrased, but I know you are reviewing the application guidelines in further detail in this workshop, so you will have access to the FY24 guidelines if you want to see exactly how it's written. And then again, applicants must identify whether any of their chosen sites or target areas are located within CGIST disadvantaged census tracts, which we will discuss how to find in a minute. But if you don't do that, again, maximum 2 points in this section. I really recommend that you state CGIS disadvantaged community, use that language in your application. The reviewers are only looking at what you present to them in your application and what you write down. They won't be checking these tools for you. So it's best to be very clear that your project does apply here. And points are awarded based on the extent and quality of response. So the first tool we'll look at is CGIST. As stated in the FY24 grant guidelines, applicants are encouraged to use the Climate and Economic Justice Screening tool to identify whether their priority sites are within a disadvantaged census tract for purposes of Justice 40. So CGIST stands for the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, and it was established as part of the Justice 40 initiative, which was a component of a 2021 executive order, which declared that 40% of overall benefits of certain climate, clean energy, et cetera, investments go towards disadvantaged communities that are marginalized by underinvestment and overburdened by pollution. So CGIST is an interactive map with data sets intended to be used to identify any communities meeting that Justice 40 criteria. There are 8 indicators of burden, they're called, or we can think of them like categories that are used to break down this criteria that we'll see in a moment. And the data in CGIST comes from publicly available and nationally consistent databases. So CGIST looks at environmental burdens by census tracts, and communities in CGIST are considered disadvantaged if 1, they are in census tracts that meet the thresholds of burden for at least one of those categories, or 2, if they are on lands within boundaries of federally recognized tribes based on 2010 census data. And this will probably all make a little more sense as we walk through the tool. So for the purposes of Brownfields grant writing, you'll already know where you're proposing to address before you open up a CGIST site. But you could start with an address, a city, or a zip code. So if I enter a Chicago zip code, this is what my screen looks like. And if I click right here where this blue outline is, more information, oops, I don't want to do that yet. More information will pop up. That blue shading tells you that that's a disadvantaged census tract, and the blue outline indicates the census tract that I have clicked on. So when I click on a census tract, this screen will pop up. This panel will pop up on the right side of the map. It's one long panel, but for the purposes of today and fitting on the screen, I split it into 2. Top half of this panel shows you census tract information, so number, county, state, population, expanded demographics information. And the bottom half shows you those 8 indicators of burden that I mentioned before. So climate change, energy, health, housing, legacy pollution, transportation, wastewater, and water, and workforce development. So if you click on that plus button next to any one of those categories, it'll expand to show you more information. So for example, if I clicked on the health button, I would see a lot of information, but one of them would be the share of people who've been told that they have asthma in that census tract compared to the rest of the country. And any burden that is above the 90th percentile, meaning more than 90% of the country, people in that census tract are experiencing it. Anything above that 90th percentile means that the threshold is met. So we will dive right into CGIST and make this make a little more sense. And I'm going to turn my camera off so that I don't lose connection, because that has happened a few times. Okay. So this is what the CGIST map looks like. And if I go to Cincinnati, I'll go to Ohio first and just show you. There we go. I can zoom into Cincinnati or any city area, it doesn't matter. Oh boy, there we go. We're slowly loading. So if I zoom in more and I got blue shaded areas that are indicating that this tool has identified it as a census tract. We see that blue outline pop up, so I know exactly where I'm looking. And then this is the panel we just saw on the slide. So tract information, city, county, etc., demographics, and then a quick yes or no. Is this identified as disadvantaged, and a why? This tract is considered disadvantaged because it meets more than one burden threshold and the associated socioeconomic threshold. Put a pin in that associated socioeconomic threshold bit for a moment. I will explain that. So if we scroll down, we see these 8 indicators of burden, and the ones that have turned blue are those that have those burdens that have been met. So for climate change, expected agriculture loss rate is above the 90th percentile, so it's highlighted in blue. Projected flood risk is highlighted in blue, it's 92nd percentile. And then at the bottom, we see this and low income, which has a different threshold of above 69th or 65th percentile, excuse me. So people in households where income is less than or equal to twice the federal poverty level, not including students enrolled in higher ed. That and low income, you'll see it on every single one of these categories, and low income must also be met in addition to one of these climate change factors in order for this climate change burden to be met. We can see the same thing with housing, lack of indoor plumbing, 98th percentile, lead paint, 98th percentile, and low income. Then, so this tool is giving you a quick yes or no. Is this disadvantaged and why? And then you can put that in your application and say, our target area is this portion of Cincinnati, and within our target area, this census tract is identified as disadvantaged because it meets X burden threshold and the associated socioeconomic threshold. There is slightly different data used for US territories because the US collects different data in different ways. Won't be relevant for Ohio purposes. And a note on tribal nations to respect tribal sovereignty and self-government. Land within the boundaries of federally recognized tribes are identified as disadvantaged on the map. Alaska Native villages are included as point locations that are smaller than a census tract. If you want to know more about how this conclusion was reached, you can go to this site, click on these links, and dig in a little bit more. On the methodology and data page, you can get a different perspective on these categories of burdens. So you can see everything that makes up the climate change category. Expected agriculture loss rate, expected building loss rate, population loss rate, projected flood risk, projected wildfire, and low income. Same thing for energy, health, housing. And if I click on these links, so low life expectancy for health, I can see how the tool is actually reaching these numbers, the sources they're using, where it's coming from. And I can do that with every single metric that's measured in this tool. the last thing I want to show you on this tool is the downloads page. There's a couple support documents, technical support, instructions to federal agencies, but if you're curious on how federal agencies are using this or how to use the list of communities. These are the list of communities. They're big files, Excel files that list every single community that this tool maps and every single measurement under those categories of burden and what percentile it's at, whether it's met or not. It's a lot of data, but if you prefer to digest information like that, you can download those and separate out the communities that apply to your application. So again, be sure to state that within your target area for your project, there is or is not a disadvantaged census tract as defined by CGIST Justice 40, or in a more eloquent way than that. Just be sure to identify though that it is or is not identified within this tool. Do we have any questions right now?
Nothing yet.
Okay, great. Then I will.
Riley, we just had one come up.
Yeah.
It says for smaller populated counties with only 2 cities as determined by the state law, is there any interpolation tool for undefined areas that are not cities?
Can you read that back to me one more time?
Sorry. For smaller populated counties with only 2 cities as determined by the state law, is there any interpolation tool for undefined areas that are not cities? Robert, do you want to try and clarify that a little bit?
Yes, I would appreciate that.
Unincorporated areas.
Oh, okay. Let me think on that. I'm not sure if CGIST handles cities versus unincorporated areas differently, because this is all measured by census tract.
Yeah.
But Robert, if you want to send me an email, I'll have it linked or listed at the end of the slides. And if you have further questions and how that applies, we can talk about that.
Yeah, Robert, just I would send her an email.
Do we have any other questions?
Not yet.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Then we can move on to EJ Screen. As stated in the FY24 grant guidelines, applicants are encouraged to use the EJ Screen tool or some other EJ-focused geospatial mapping tools to gain a better understanding of the communities that may be adversely and disproportionately affected by environmental or human health harms and risks. So CGIST will give you that yes/no of whether your community is within a disadvantaged census tract. And EJ Screen will give you some information that gets a little more specific and you can play around with a little bit more. EJ Screen is a nationally consistent data set. It combines environmental and demographic data into maps and reports for public use. And it's a great tool to get a bird's eye view of populations that may be disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice. It's annually updated and typically goes through some pretty major modifications to become an even more useful tool. They're adding data points, map layers, etc. And there are 7 built-in maps to start with that you can get a lot of your information from. The environmental burden indicators, socioeconomic indicators, environmental justice indexes, supplemental indexes, climate change, health disparities, critical service gaps. And we will go right into EJ Screen because I think that is the best way to absorb this information. So when you first open this site up, you see a blank map and might send you to a random location. You can go over into Columbus this time. So on the right, there's a search bar. If you know an address or a specific place you're looking for, you can input that. And then over here on the left is our data to play with. So we'll look at these maps first. If we look at environmental burden indicators, this is our environmental data that is in EJ screen at face value. So we can look at ozone exposure in this area. And then you'll get this red to white gradient that shows you percentile of exposure. Maybe we can look at lead paint. It's loading a little slow today. Get a little more variety in there. And then if I were to, because I click on right here, we see this blue outline pop up. EJ screen measures by the block group. CGIST measures by the census tract. So a block group is an even smaller community measurement. So this is even more specific information. And then we'll get this text box that pops up, Clark County, Ohio population and lead paint percentile. It's in the 95th percentile. At the same time, we can see the demographic index, low income percentile, and people of color percentile. It's just information you can get side by side. It is not being factored into this lead paint percentile number at this moment.
Excuse me, Riley, could you explain what percentile means?
Yes. So if we are looking here in Clark County, Ohio, 97th percentile, that means that people in this block group are 97% more likely to be living amongst lead paint than the rest of the country. So it's a way to compare your exposure risk. We can look at Superfund and zoom out a little bit more. Superfund proximity. So again, like people right here are, people in this block group are closer to a Superfund site than 95% to 100% of the rest of the country. So if we move on to socioeconomic indicators, environmental burden indicators are our environmental data. Socioeconomic indicators are people data. So we can see low income, we can see unemployment rate, limited English speaking, less than a high school education, under the age of 5, over the age of 64. One of the cool things about this layer is that some of these burdens are combined into indexes. So the demographic index, we'll go down this way. Demographic index, we can click on this block group right here, is in the 91st percentile. You're like, what does that mean? The demographic index. There's this button, demographic index. I don't know why my screen is so zoomed in. There we go. demographic index in EJ screen is a combination of percent low income and percent minority, two socioeconomic factors that were explicitly named in Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice. Basically, the demographic index is combining percentile people of color and percent low income and giving you that intersectional lens here. So an example way to use this, if you are with community and your community has a revitalization plan prioritizing assessing and cleaning up properties in order to make way for new business. If it's in an area with a high unemployment rate, you could talk about how name the areas where the unemployment rate is above the 90th percentile, above the 95th percentile, and then talk about how funding would help generate more jobs in the area long term. Environmental justice indexes are where it all comes together. So we can see these same environmental burden indicators as we saw right up here. But now, let's do lead paint again. If we click on what does this mean, lead paint EJ index combines the environmental burden indicator for lead paint with the demographic index, which is an average of percentile low income and percentile people of color. So we're looking at the intersection between how a community is experiencing low income and how and the percentile of people of color in that community, overlaid with exposure to lead paint. So these indexes show where environmental and socioeconomic burdens are disproportionately high and intersecting.
Riley, we have another question.
Yep.
So this demographic index sounds like somewhat of a summary. Is there another toggle in there that summarizes all of the effects, or basically says this block group has everything going against it?
There is not a button that has everything. There is the supplemental demographic index, which has some other factors that are combined. So this one is percentile low income, persons with disabilities, percent less than high school education and limited English speaking, and low life expectancy. But we don't have the option in EJ screen to layer every single burden indicator and see who's most at risk. If you want to, in your application, convey that message, you can talk about the supplemental demographic index and then in a separate sentence layer on lead paint issues, hazardous waste proximity, but there's not a good way to see it all in one. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay. One thing to note is that, Superfund again. Click on what this means is telling you. Superfund proximity plus average percent low income and average people of color, percent people of color. This is not something you have to explain in your application. Reviewers understand what the environmental justice index is measuring versus the environmental burden indicator map. All you have to do is explain what you're seeing in EJ screen and how it applies to your community. Lastly, the supplemental indexes, they're the same environmental burden list, but now we are, instead of looking at the demographic index, we're looking at the supplemental demographic index, which is that longer list of socioeconomic indicators percent low income, percent persons with disabilities, percent English speaking, percent less than a high school education, and low life expectancy. Just a different way to look at the same environmental burden, but with different indicators intersecting. So a way to use this part of the data, if you're applying for an assessment grant for a target area with a block group that has a high percentile of lead paint under the Environmental Justice Index, you can talk about making strides towards environmental justice by assessing properties for lead paint and starting the cleanup and revitalization process and customizing that issue a little bit more to your community. There's more information in the climate change map. So flood risk, 100-year floodplain, sea level rise, and extreme heat. Extreme heat, you can talk about maybe creating green space, absorbing some of that heat perhaps. Health disparities will help you answer some of those questions in the community needs section. There's asthma, heart disease, low life expectancy, cancer. And then critical service gaps has broadband gaps, lack of health insurance, housing burden, transportation access, and food desert. Housing burden could be really relevant if you are working on a housing project. You can talk about the need for funding for a housing project in this area. In the tools button, you can import a shapefile if you've got a very specific area you're looking at. Otherwise, you can import other map links to map out where you want to look. You can add additional demographics. It's really not necessary for these purposes. And then if you want to look at specific zip codes or congressional districts, counties, states, EPA regions, urban areas, you can use this boundaries option. Under places, there's some other really cool data that's not all going to be helpful, but some of it could be depending on your community. There's a list of EPA regulated facilities, so we can see the actual location of Superfund sites or other brownfields or water dischargers or hazardous waste sites. Other environmental data, a lot of this is more in depth than you need to get for the purposes of the brownfields application. Community landmarks, you can see schools, places of worship, parks, prisons, public housing, subsidized housing. It depends on what you're applying for and what your community's revitalization goal is. Tribal lands, colonias, and designated disadvantaged communities. So you can also see CGIST communities in this tool if you'd like. I think it's more complicated to look at both in each than it is to use the two different tools, but it's an option. Okay. Get rid of that, get rid of that. Lastly, there's this reports tool where you can drop a pin or draw an area or select an area. And let's say I want to look right here. I can drop a pin. I can give it a 5-mile buffer or a 10-mile buffer or however you choose to look at your community. And I can click EJ Screen Community Report. And now I have one page of all of the environmental burden indicators, socioeconomic indicators, and those overlaid indexes for this 5-mile ring around the latitude and longitude points where I dropped a pin. So I can see everything that the maps page of EJ Screen has to offer in this one PDF. I can see percent low income, percent people of color, percent with less than a high school education, life expectancy, per capita income. I see a map, a little screen capture of what the EJ Screen site page looked like. Languages spoken at home, broken down by race, age, English speaking breakdown. And then I can see those environmental justice indexes. And I can see it at state percentile and national percentile. You can do the same with the supplemental indexes, which again is the low income, persons with disabilities, percent less than a high school education, limited English speaking, low life expectancy, whereas the environmental justice index is data on low income and people of color populations. It's the same exact thing you're seeing in EJ Screen. It's a different way to look at it. And this is a good way to pull exactly what you're seeing into your files. I can see all of the environmental burden indicators at face value, their percentile in the state, their percentile in the US, same with the socioeconomic indicators. I can see if there are any sites reporting to the EPA, so Superfund or air pollution sites or water dischargers, schools, hospitals, places of worship. And it will tell me if we are in a Justice 40 CGIS disadvantaged community, yes or no. And then the additional information on health indicators, climate indicators, and critical service gaps. So it's just another way to look at everything to absorb the information, but that is a great resource. Do we have any questions?
No, it doesn't look like we do.
Okay, that's fine.
Why don't we, if we've got a couple minutes here, why don't you
Okay.
do the EJ Screen walkthrough on maybe something a bit more rural?
Sure.
Can anybody throw out I'm trying to think of, how about Zanesville, Ohio?
Sure. Can you give me a spelling?
Zanesv. Yeah, there you go.
All right. So we can go straight into environmental justice indexes, and let's look at lead paint is a good one to start with.
Oh, yeah, they probably have plenty of that.
Mm-hmm. So we can see, oh, come on. There we go. In this area, we're dealing with the 92 percentile exposure to lead paint. And then we can see the demographic index that's being factored in here because it's the environmental justice index. We know that in the environmental justice index, low income and people of color are taken into account. So it's these three numbers that are adding to this number.
Okay.
We don't need to know the specifics of how that equation breaks down. But if you ever are confused, what is this?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. If you ever lose your way, confused about, geez, what does the environmental justice index measure again? You can click this, what does this mean button? Apparently I can't right now, but usually it works.
Yeah.
And it will tell you the breakdown of that.
Why don't you try underground storage tanks and maybe explain what that is?
Sure. Carla might have a better explanation than I do about an underground storage tank.
I would think that they would be all the permitted underground storage tanks in the area. That's what I was thinking. It's
Yeah,
not,
I would click on what does this mean? This is a good time,
Yes.
because I mean, we all know what an underground storage tank is, but
yeah,
Yeah.
what are they really measuring? I don't know.
yeah, okay.
Struggling with Wi-Fi over here. But yes, it's going to tell you your percentile exposure to a known underground storage tank in the area. So how much closer you are to an underground storage tank than somebody else, and the average citizen in the rest of the country, or the average citizen in the rest of the state.
And you will find with these areas, if you're on a highway, there's going to be the diesel emissions that you might want to consider looking at. It just depends on the area.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, so we can see there's concentration right around here of that diesel particulate matter in the 91st percentile.
Yeah.
And we can look at that same environmental burden under supplemental indexes and see how the percentile or your exposure risk changes depending on these people issues that you are comparing to the demographic index. So our people data here is low income, low life expectancy, persons with disabilities, less than a high school education, limited English speaking. So these indicators will yield a higher number than those in the environmental justice index. It's just a different way of looking at the data. It depends on what you know about your community and what you can communicate to EPA reviewers in your application. Did we have any other questions?
This is Amy. I was just going to say, I think with the environmental indicators, it's good to kind of click through all of them. You know, is if you've got your target area and it's connecting, you know, with a census block group, because you can speak more holistically in the EJ sections of Section 2 about what you're closest to. You know, this population has these problems, low income and so on. And they're also close to this 2 Superfund sites, you know, 3 hazardous waste sites. So they are getting an unfair burden of pollution on top of the fact that they have these other socioeconomic indicators.
Correct. Yep. Yep. So this tool is giving you information to work with, data to play with, but it all comes down to what you know about your community, how you can apply it, and how you see these environmental burden indicators or socioeconomic indicators playing out in real time. Okay, how are we doing on time? I have just a couple slides to move through.
Oh, you have plenty of time. You go ahead.
Okay. Okay, great. Then stop share so I can play with this. We will talk about the differences between EJ Screen and CGIST. There we go. So CGIST is really meant to give us that yes or no identification. whether the community falls under that disadvantaged community umbrella as defined in the Justice 40 initiative. EJ Screen is mapping all sorts of other factors. The data is left up for a lot more interpretation and application. CJIS is giving us insight into which communities are receiving funding via that Justice 40 initiative. And CJIS uses census tracts, while EJ Screen scales it down even more to block groups. CJIS is great for more in-depth analysis, for screening, for outreach purposes, analytical purposes regarding program implementation and policy development. So just a couple examples. I won't read word for word everything that's on the slide, but these slides are available to you if you want to go back to them. This is paraphrased one of the questions in last year's application that we talked about earlier. It says, identify the sensitive populations within the target areas, the severity of those health or welfare issues experienced, and how this grant will address those or will facilitate the identification and reduction of threats to the health or welfare of such groups. Some of the strengths in this response, there's a great level of detail. We can really see that there's numbers and data coming from EJ Screen and CJIS. For example, the percentile of all people and children living below the poverty level, or what's another example? Percent homes built in 1939 or earlier. That's great data to have to convey to your reader about, in combination with other information. For example, the significant pollutants mentioned previously. We'll take them at their word that they mentioned environmental burden indicators earlier in the application. We can see how these things are combining to create health or welfare issues. Sensitive populations are also very clearly identified in this response. We see in this first sentence, minorities, children, persons living in poverty, and women of childbearing age. The con of this response is that it doesn't discuss the extent to which the grant will address threats to target populations. We get a lot of information about what's happening, but we're missing that second half of the question regarding how the grant will address those or will facilitate identification and reduction of threats. We kind of get one sentence right at the end about by addressing the environmental contaminant issues in the target area, any threat of exposure by nearby sensitive populations will be reduced or eliminated. We don't get a whole lot about how those will be addressed. One other example here, again, a paraphrased answer and a paraphrased question, but as we saw earlier, discuss how funding would advance environmental justice and minimize displacement among underserved communities in the target area. Two great things about this application. We see clear data about clear information about new jobs, employment opportunities, green space. To the reviewer, it's very clear what kind of issues the applicant wants to address here and how they want how those would advance environmental justice. There's also a statement about bringing in new tax revenue and reinvestment, and coupled with their response to the prior application, the prior question in the application, what we hope they've identified what the environmental justice issues are. We can see in this response to the second question how they would advance environmental justice. Two things to improve on in this response. First, there's not a lot of detail on how the applicant would minimize displacement in the target area. And that is a clear part of the question. And unless it's mentioned somewhere else in the application, we aren't seeing that there are CGIST disadvantaged census tracts anywhere in this target area. If it's mentioned somewhere else in the application, that's fine. That's not a reason to get points docked, but we'll assume for now that it hasn't been mentioned at all. And that is, as we mentioned earlier, a maximum of 2 points if you can't identify a disadvantaged census tract within your project. So at the end of the day, you all are the experts of the communities that you're working in, and CGIST and EJ Screen can give you the information to work with, but it's an opportunity for you to apply that information to what you know about your communities and what's actually happening there. The most important part is to be very specific about the environmental justice issues that your community is facing, and to use your knowledge as the community expert to apply that information and explain to application reviewers how said issues can be addressed through funding. So make those connections for your reviewer. So thank you all very much. I can take a couple of questions if we still have some. My email and my phone number are on the screen, and I'm pretty sure these slides are available to you. So please reach out if you have questions that we can't answer today, or you don't want to get into today. If you want to set up a meeting, that's fine too.
I think we're good for now. I think we've handled some of the questions in the chat.
Okay.
But Riley,
Great.
thank you again. We
course.
appreciate what you've done here. Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Well, then we'll get ready to move on to tab easy. E-tool for EPA Brownfields Grants. Okay, this is a tool created by KSU Tab, and it actually walks you through each of the grants, which would be community-wide assessment, coalition assessment, community-wide assessment for states and tribes, the Revolving Loan Fund, and cleanup grants. It's free to everyone, and I think it's worth giving it a spin and at least use some of those functioning parts that might be helpful to you. As a grant writer, I certainly did. Next slide, please. So the first thing you do is go to KSU Tab. If you don't already have an account, you'll just need to create an account. It's pretty easy. Your information will always be private, particularly when it comes to the Tab Easy tool, actually all the time. But so you go ahead and create your login. You go to ksutab.org. You go to eTools from there, and then you go to Tab Easy. Next slide, please. So with this, what I've done, if you go into it, you're going to start a new grant. You name that grant, the type. You get a drop down on type, and you give it a name, and you save it. And next slide, please. And this is what you'll get. You'll get sort of an overview about the tool, but then you'll want to go to application configuration, and that's pretty important. That's going to get you set up for the type of grant that you are wanting to write. Next slide, please. So here with this is what the application configuration looks like. You have, let's say you go with this amount of funding, you're a regional council, you don't have an EPA Brownfields grant, but there's a drop down where you do answer, you do. And no non-lead member has an open grant. And you save that and continue. Next slide, please. So then what I've done here is with the setup, I've gone to threshold criteria for a coalition grant. And as you see here, once I select that on the right-hand side, you'll see the threshold criteria for coalition assessment grants. It drops down. And if you see all the drop-down features, those are areas that you will be filling out. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of how threshold criteria does vary by grant. So community-wide, there's less threshold. And as you get into cleanup grants, there's a pretty decent list here of threshold items that you have to fill out. So if you're considering a cleanup grant this go around, go ahead and give this a spin and see how the threshold criteria works for you. I think it's worth your time. You get much more information about what is expected, and you can get started on those threshold items now. Actually, that's the case for any of these, but cleanup for sure. Next slide, please. So now what I've done is I've gone past threshold, and what I want to do is look at the narrative ranking criteria. And this is a criteria we've been talking about the last day and today. So there you have the drop down on everything that you will have to fill out. Next slide, please. And what I've done here is with the drop down, I decided to go into project area description and go into overview of brownfields challenges and description. So that's on the purple ribbon to the left. You open it up, there is the criteria. It gives you the criteria. It also gives you then the evaluation criteria. So you have both pieces of information in one place. And then you can also go to helpful hints, which I'll show in a minute. But here, if you look, I put text in there. So the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plains. It'd be a great way to start the section, but it won't make any sense. But if you put text into that and save it, you will get a half-filled bubble. That means you'll need to go back to that section you haven't completed. If you put save and complete, the bubble would be filled in. So that should be a signal that the section is done. Next slide, please. And with the, I'm not sure, I think we just covered that. So next slide, please. So then you have a drop down. I'm showing you the helpful hints. So not only do you have the criteria, the narrative piece, you have the evaluation criteria, and then you have helpful hints, things to think of as you're filling out your grant application. Next slide, please. You can always export to Word. What I've done quite a few times is I put the outline together on Word just to give me an idea of where I'm working. And these are all already outlined according to what you see in the guidelines. Currently, what you're going to see is funding year 24 guidelines. Once 25 guidelines are out, we'll be changing that, and typically within 2 weeks after the guidelines are issued. So this, you can also then fill in the text piece. If you could go back one slide, thank you. Go back another slide, sorry, it doesn't show it very well. So here, if you look down in the text box, you can be filling out as much as you want there. And when you print it out, export to Word, you will get all of your narrative in the order that you need it in the sequence that you need it in with titles. So go next slide, next slide. And are there any questions? Next slide. I hope everyone gets a chance to take a look. Please give us a call if you need a little help with it. It's worthy to take your time with, just to get an idea of what you'll be responding to in the grant application. So it's definitely worth your time. So now we'll start with the panel presentation. the grant walkthrough for sections 3 and 4. And our panel members for this are Melissa Zoller, Carla Ocker, Dan Doker, and Sally Cladwell. And any of the other speakers, if they'd like to chip in. So let's go to the first slide here. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea, the task description, cost estimates, measuring success, that has a few points in it. Don't ignore it. Don't just think you're throwing a lot of numbers on paper. You really have to think this one through. And a lot of times this is the downfall for some communities that aren't successful. Next slide, please. And in section 3, you're really outlining your project. And this is something you should probably be thinking about now. Because if you wait until September, October, I think it gets more complicated. But if you lay out an outline, you'll understand better how you're going to approach this project and how to be successful. So with the task, example task can be program management, community outreach, assessment, cleanup, reuse planning. Typically try to keep your tasks to 4. I see a lot of those that are 5, but I think a lot of times you can bundle certain activities, like program management can also include community outreach. If you want to break those 2 apart, you can do that, but cleanup could also include reuse planning. So just kind of think through your task. How are you going to go about doing them? When will you have those tasks done? Now, everyone, the EPA understands that you may have changes because, you know, it's funding year 2024. It's 2024, and next year in 2025, things may have changed. The schedule can change as you develop your work plan, but you pretty much want to stick to it. Who is leading the project? Honestly, you should be, the majority of the task, you, the community, should be leading the project. Your QEP is there for support, but you're also overseeing your QEP. So think about who the lead is. And then the outputs with things like quarterly reports, community meetings, that type of thing. How many community meetings? How many quarterly reports? Next slide, please. And typical eligible tasks. Now, here are some typical eligible tasks, like program management. It shows you different, you know, procurement is involved with that. Financial and records management is involved. So this outlines some of those items. Dan, did you have something to add to this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of keep in mind, maybe drilling down a little bit on phase 1 and phase 2 as, you know, a common assessment. But if there's a building on the property or your priority property, or looking at a corridor or like a downtown, asbestos surveys and lead paint surveys, we do those fairly frequently in our TBA because that's often an eligible expense, or to remove that asbestos or deal with those issues as part of the whole project. And that's what makes it a brownfield, to address especially a lot of the downtown buildings.
Did I miss your comments for the slide before this?
No, you're doing fine.
Oh,
I
good.
did not have any.
Oh, yay. Okay, good. Melissa, did you have comments here?
Yeah, I just want everybody to take some time and really think. You're developing this application and we're talking about, you know, what you're going to do and how it's going to happen. But you really need to take that time to be thinking about who's going to be responsible for each task. How long is it really going to take? How are we going to ensure the outcomes are actually going to be met? We get so involved in the application process that we kind of forget to think about, once we're awarded, what is it going to take for us to be able to complete this project?
And again, if you are working with a QEP and they're developing this for you, they're going to develop a time frame that I hate to say it, might be something that you're going to see on a lot of applications. This is about you. This is your program, your project. And if you don't know the answers to some of these things, please reach out to, of course, EPA, to KSU TAB, or to other communities that have gotten grants over time. Next slide, please. And the proposed cleanup plan. This is for cleanup grants only. And again, the grant will be evaluated on the degree of the quality and reasonableness of the proposed cleanup plan. Make sure it makes sense. Dan, did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of give you some ideas of typical cleanup activities that might occur at a brownfield. We see a lot of applicants will look at soil removal as a common remedy, excavation and disposal of your contamination. But at the same time, in Ohio, we have a risk-based cleanup through the voluntary action. So there's a lot of caps, covers, and even an asphalt pavement or parking lot can be a remedy at a site. And occasionally, groundwater injections or bioremediation might occur to clean up a groundwater plume. And we do see a lot of vapor systems get installed. These are basically radon systems under slabs that help, address vapor issues that might be involved with a cleanup at a building. And another piece to not forget about is if the project in a cleanup is going through the VAP, there's NFA letter fees and consulting fees to get a project through that program. And so those are things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Beth, I'd like to add one thing to that. Dan, thanks for explaining all those different options. One thing you need to keep in mind, and it goes along with what Beth has highlighted here, to include the details of the cleanup plan. Don't just refer back to your APCA. That's the analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives. A draft APCA is a requirement for the cleanup grants. However, we do not review the APCA. We don't review the APCA and make comments or score based on what's in the APCA and whether we think it's the right approach or not. So, keep in mind that most of the reviewers are going to go back and take a look at the APCA, but not all of them. So don't count on information in the APCA informing your reviewer about what's going on. Make sure that you summarize the APCA in your application.
Thank you. And then now is a good time to make sure you've got that phase 2 complete, or it's in process and getting there, so that you can complete the draft APCA, analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, in time for the community involvement, which is typically, you should be looking at October for the first, like a public meeting about the cleanup. Consider that changes in costs may take place. So I know that costs have really changed over time in the consulting world, the contractor world. And so don't go by something you did 2 years ago. Get a good idea of the cost, and definitely check in with Dan and Shelby about what you should anticipate. They may have a good idea in terms of some of the work they've done in Ohio. Next slide, please. Project implementation. So where we've gotten these deficiencies are just what past grant debriefings have brought to our communities, who bring that information back to us. So many times, poor description of tasks, lack of milestones. You need more detail on the contractual task, or there's too many tasks. So to do now, as I mentioned earlier, identify your task, plan the details, adjust as you go. Next slide.
Beth?
Oh, sure.
Beth?
Yes.
Oh, it's Amy. Yeah,
I'm
with
sorry,
respect
Amy.
to the last slide, I just wanted to say something that I've noticed a couple of times in reviewing grants, is that when they're, when you're discussing your tasks, I've seen where they'll discuss a task like maybe getting a planning coordinator or contractor on board, but they don't include it in their budget. So if you're going to do something, make sure it's reflected in your budget. And that's just one other thing I've seen.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So here's a description of tasks. Selected this, it seemed like very thorough overview of what was going to be done for site assessments. They give a schedule, activities to begin by the second quarter and continue to the end. Who the lead is on it. The environmental consultant will manage all the technical aspects, but they're still overseen by the city's Brownfields project director. And then the outputs are access agreements, eligibility determinations, a quality assurance project plan, 10 phase ones, 10 phase twos. That's from Barberton. Next slide, please. Here we have the description of task activities and outputs. Discuss the schedule. As you saw earlier, they had I thought they had a relatively good schedule. Be very specific, but it's okay if it really doesn't exactly match later. Inventory can always begin in the first quarter, but don't say in your first quarter that you're hiring, you're doing your procurement, you're starting your phase ones, you're working on your QAP in the very first quarter. That should be a time where you really start, give yourself some time. Give yourself some time. And if you need to ask others about when should I do these types of tasks? There are a lot of folks here that are resources to you. Please reach out. Also, anticipated schedule of tasks wasn't logical. In other words, the RFQ for a consultant is going to go out at the end of the first quarter, but while assessments led by the consultant are already occurring. Well, that doesn't apply. So to do now, just research how long your activities will take, draft your schedule. Next slide, please.
And Beth, can I interject here?
Certainly.
Just some more kind of tips on the schedule. Many of you probably know, but you can start your phase one assessments during that first quarter, even while the contractor is being procured. You just can't start your phase two assessments until after the contractor is procured, because you have to have a quality assurance project plan, which is outlines the standard operating procedures for both field sample collection as well as the laboratories analytical standard operating procedures / SOPs. So that's something to look at. Another thing to keep in mind is if you really want to get going, you can procure your contractor between the time that the grants are announced, which would be May to early June, and the time that the cooperative agreement will be awarded, which would be October 1st. So either you can procure your contractor following federal procurement regulations prior to the grant project period start date, and pay for those yourself, which a lot of grantees do. That's kind of an easy thing to do. Or you can request pre-award costs. You're allowed to incur costs up to 90 days prior to the grant being awarded, which, as long as you're getting your paperwork in on time, your grant will be awarded by October 1st of 2025. But you're incurring those at your own cost. But once the grant is announced that you're going to get the grant, unless you've lied about something, you're not going to not get your grant. So you can feel pretty confident. Now, the thing to remember about that is you have to, in your grant application or in your project, in your work plan, which is created after the grant announcement, but you should also mention this in your grant application, you need to request pre-award costs. You can't just assume and start incurring those costs. So I suggest if you're, want to get started, hit the ground running on October 1st and start with phase 2 assessments, think about either pre-award costs or to pay for procuring your environmental consultant, or plan on incurring those costs yourself.
So where would you put that? Would you put that when you're doing the cost estimates?
Yeah, and your cost estimates in your budget, because you're talking, during your, not so much cost estimates, but the budget or the schedule and the cost estimates are kind of all wrapped up in one area. So, you have to identify what your schedule is, just like you were just talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, so you would do it in that period. And it only has to be a sentence or two. You don't have to get into great detail.
No. Okay.
Carla, there's a question for you. When you mentioned starting the phase 1s or, procuring the CP, did you mean starting targeting or actual work on the phase 1? How many communities have a QEP doing this type of work?
That last part, I don't really understand.
Yeah, I'm thinking they're probably asking, are you doing the actual phase 1 work, or is it more the procurement of the environmental professional, or both?
Okay, yeah, you know what? I apologize. I probably wasn't particularly clear on that. Let me rephrase. You can procure once you procure your contractor. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did confuse you guys. Once you procure your contractor, if you say, for instance, you procure it prior to October 1st, which is the beginning of the project period for your grant, once that contractor is procured, they can start on their phase. They can do everything but phase 2 assessments. They can start on the phase 1 assessments. They can actually do them because the phase 1 assessments don't require any kind of sample collection and analytical. So, but you can't start your phase 2 assessments until after the grant's awarded and you've had a quality assurance project plan submitted to US EPA, along with a checklist. That's kind of a whole nother story, but basically procured, your quality assurance project plan has to be approved prior to starting the phase 2s.
Yeah. And I think there was a little confusion as to, can a person who's not a QEP do the phase 1? And I think that's been cleared up too. No, you have to have, as you mentioned, be through that procural process.
Yes. And that was totally my poor presentation and kind of skipping the quality assurance project plan section. So thank you. Thanks for whoever asked that question. Thanks, so that I could clarify.
Okay. So provide information on how cost estimates for each task were developed per budget category. Dan, I think you had some comments on this.
Yeah, I thought it would be helpful maybe just from our experience to give you some ballpark numbers of what some of these things can cost. If you're already talking with a contractor, they're helping you with your application, they can help you get these types of estimates as well. But from our experience, phase 1 can be, and especially if it's a VAP compliant, we often do both ASTM and VAP compliant in Ohio. So you at a minimum, you need to meet ASTM for your grant request. It's a federal requirement, but VAP helps you get through the VAP program should the site ever be in that program. They can run from about $4,000 to $6,000 typically, sometimes a little more if it's a larger property. Asbestos surveys anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000, and they can go higher if it's a large building with lots of rooms. So those numbers can expand quickly. And the lead paint survey is often done together with the asbestos. Phase twos are a basic limited phase two to assess a site. We see them typically 20 to 40,000. But to meet VAP requirements, if you want to do the more thorough assessments and meeting a lot of their extra requirements, we see those anywhere from 35, 40 to even over 100,000, 150,000 for a large site with lots of wrecks or identified areas. So those are some things to keep in mind on the scope of your project, that yes, assessment can't quickly, if it's a VAP project, can eat up a lot of, maybe it's one or two projects because of the overall cost to do that assessment on a large old facility, for example.
Wow, that is a lot of good information. Thank you. Now, with the VAP program, is that your way to have an approved, like, a cleanup plan? Or what are the advantages to going through the VAP program?
The VAP would be, it's typically an endpoint for a US EPA cleanup grant, and a lot of Department of Development grants here in Ohio. An endpoint needs to be determined, and typically they go through NFA and VAP as well. So having all that information and being in the program sets you up for success, especially from going from an assessment to a cleanup eventually.
Yeah, great. Okay. These are some other thoughts, and hopefully you'll go back and reference these slides. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here is kind of a breakdown of task 1, task 2 for this applicant. I think they did a nice job of providing the number of like community education meetings, breaking it down to how much per meeting, how many hours, how much per hour. I think they do a nice job here with that. Next slide, please. Here is a budget that I took from an EPA presentation last year. I think it just points out the various budget categories you could possibly have. Most applications don't have that. And also, since this is an assessment grant application, you won't have construction as a budget category. Also, with respect to the project task, there's too many here. Typically, like we've said before, keep it to 4 or 5, and 5 at the most. I think it's helpful for the reviewer. It also helps you really kind of firm up that plan. So that's just my advice there. And look at other grant applications. How did they go about? Check out the successful ones, but how did they go about putting their budget table together? Next slide, please. Oh, and by the way, when you're doing your budget, use the budget table that the EPA provides. Keep it simple. Don't get creative. Don't get fancy. And here's a cleanup grant application budget example, and this does include construction. And there's a note if 50% or more of the estimated contract costs are for construction, then the cost for the entire contract belongs on the construction budget line. Next slide, please. So the plan to measure and evaluate environmental progress and results. This is how you're going to track. How are you going to measure? How are you going to evaluate progress? How are you going to evaluate success? So these are the things. We've got some deficiencies noted in past grant debriefings. Include the completion of a cleanup plan as a measured result to track. If you have 5 cleanup plans in your budget, that would be something you should be tracking. Explain the grantee will report to EPA through ACRES. ACRES is there. You'll be using ACRES if you have a grant, and it's a great way to track progress. Lack of description of outputs. Need to include outcomes in addition to outputs. So here are some things you could do now. Identify the quantifiable outcomes. As you show progress, relate these to outcomes and benefits of reuse strategy. Obtain initial data. So this is the time to do that. Next slide, please. And here's measure. Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry for interjecting. Can I just add one thing to the prior slide?
of course.
Thanks. Oh, another thing, well, oops, there we go. Amy said something really powerful yesterday when she was reviewing data regarding the US EPA funded grants, and that is that for every US EPA brownfield dollar awarded, $21.07 in return on investment is realized. So one of the things we can do is to commit to tracking the return on investment of the US EPA's investment in the assessments. And that helps them, track their success with the overall program, as well as the grantee's success with the particular grant.
Yeah. Increase in tax revenue is a great one to track. Now, some of those won't happen immediately, but that commitment would be very helpful to the EPA. Next slide, please. And then measuring environmental results. And I thought they did a great job here in the summary. I really did. I felt what they were tracking was applicable with neighborhood meetings, public meetings, meetings with community groups. Really, there are quite a few meetings that you as the community will be involved with. So those are great items to be tracking. And what you track is community participation, acres assessed, acres ready for reuse, redevelopment dollars leveraged, and jobs created. That's a great example. Next slide, please. And that's it for me. And we're taking it now to programmatic capability with Amy.
Thanks, Beth. Next slide, please. This is section 4. We're getting down to the last of your grant narrative. Yay. Past performance. So you're going to be talking about your programmatic capability and your past performance. Next slide. As I mentioned, or you are near the end, as I mentioned, but don't treat this as a downhill slide to the finish. It's also a little less as far as points. You get 35 points total in this section. There are more points to be awarded in some of the others. But as we probably all have been harping on you over the last couple of days, a point can make a difference as to whether you get a grant or not. It's a competitive grant round. So do your homework, make this good. Treat it like it is a resume. You want to shine, you want to make your group shine, you want to make your organization shine, highlight all your credentials and relevant experience, just brag about yourself, brag about your team. That's going to really help because a lot of what this section is about is allowing EPA reviewers and EPA itself to feel comfortable that you can get the work done within that grant timeline, be it 4 or 5 years. Next slide. So is your organization capable of managing this grant? You want to show that they're able to carry out programmatic and administrative financial requirements to successfully manage this project. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, actually the day before, when we talk about grant capacity. If you were able to be on that webinar, there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of responsibility on you as the grantee. Things like financial reporting, drawing down the grant, reporting in acres, which is the EPA Brownfield database for grantees, procuring a environmental professional, overseeing work, whether it's assessment or cleanup, reviewing invoices. So you want to make sure that you discuss that if you've had experience doing this in the past with, it could be grants or it could be other things, you know, pull out that experience, let them know that you have those abilities. Also indicate how your team's going to be structured to make sure that these grant requirements are met. Who's going to be overseeing the project as a whole? Who's going to be doing the financial aspects of the grants? Who's are going to do the reporting? And it's fine if your environmental professional firm is going to help with parts of these, but talk about that. Make sure that you're covering these things so the reviewers are comfortable that you know what's expected of you and you have the team to do it. Next slide. Acquiring additional resources. You're going to describe your procurement process. Beth talked a little bit about this yesterday, and it is in our resource documents in the web link for this course. Make sure you look at EPA's procurement guidelines and that you follow them. It's with respect to, you know, how you look at costs, with respect to how you write your grant and what experience you're going to be asking for. You want to make sure that you're following this guidance and don't get mucked up where you might have to reissue an RFP. But do let everybody know, or do let your reviewers know that you're aware of what the requirements are and intend to follow them fully. New for FY24 and will probably, I would expect, be in the FY25 grants is describing your efforts to promote strong labor practices and local hiring and local procurement, or link members of the community to potential employment opportunities and brownfield assessment, cleanup, or redevelopment. Things like, do you have, even if your community, your city or whatever doesn't have a workforce development organization, maybe your county does, maybe there's a regional one, tap into them, talk to them, and mention those sorts of things that you are going to be looking locally. Maybe when you're having public meetings and working with your partners, you might want to think about partners that are employers and that, you know, may be able to hire individuals you know, in the community, or you know, come up with employment opportunities and interview opportunities. So just don't forget to speak to that and you know, put a little detail to it, you know, whether it's workforce development. It could be somebody in your area might have an EJ training grant, or I mean, the EPA job training grant. Speak about that if that's the case. Next slide. So here's a nice, I thought a nice language and description of organizational capacity and structure. They've talked about their chamber foundation that they're working with is been an economic development leader. They've attracted new businesses. They help current businesses grow. And they support entrepreneurial efforts. Their experienced team has the capacity to successfully carry out and manage all of these requirements of the grant. Next slide. Here, description of key tasks, the key staff. Mr. Robinson, who's going to be is the director of operations. They talk about how long he's been there, what he's done, that has done a lot for leadership, and done a lot of work on providing business expansion, economic opportunities to the county, and he'll oversee project management. They also talk about different grant awards that he has managed over time. He will be assisted by the development director and the executive administrative assistant in their organization. And they talk a little bit about the person who will be assisting him and their how long they've been with the organization, and also who's going to handle their financial, which is the executive assistant requirements. I'd like to, for the assistant and for the executive administrative person that's doing the financial, I'd like to see a little bit more about their experience in something like this. But, you know, they're hitting all the key staff that are going to be needed to actually get this grant going. Next slide. Acquiring additional resources. The county actively recruits MBE, WBE subcontractors. So if that's something you do, that's another thing that you may want to indicate in strong labor practices. The partners that they work with are assist them with workforce development and customized training, curriculum development. And so this will hopefully ensure that potential employers and employees who invest in the county, that they'll see benefits from the revitalization of brownfields. Next slide. Past performance. So you're going to discuss meaningful accomplishments and outcomes, outputs and outcomes. And it's going to, if you have had brownfield grants in the past, you're going to talk about those, no more than 3. If not, talk about a other federal or even a non-federal grant. Something that in the Indiana grant writing workshop that we had the week before that was brought out by a person that does do some of these EPA reviews is don't pick the no experience or no past performance with grants. It's worth 8 points. If you talk about EPA grants, you can get up to 15 points. If you talk about other grants, federal or non-federal, you can get up to 15 points. Even if those grants, typically they want to see something that is going to be about the same amount in value as the EPA grants, so around $500,000 and up. But if you don't have that, if you're just starting out, you're a new nonprofit in particular, you know, if you got a grant to help start your nonprofit, if you've got a foundation grant and it's not worth a whole, I mean, it's $10,000 or $50,000, not 500. Put that down, put something down, and make sure that you speak to it in glowing terms so that you really have a chance of getting those full 15 points. You don't want to lose out on 7 points. That's probably just going to knock you out of the competition. So keep that in mind, and, you know, just think back at what you can really expound on as far as grants. And also discuss your compliance with the grant work plans, schedules, and terms and conditions under the grant. Next slide. And here is past performance. They talk about, and this is in the case of someone that had a EPA Brownfield grant. This is Barberton. You are actually going to be looking at their grant and did, if you were involved in the work group exercise yesterday. So they have had grants in the past. They talk about these different grants, what they were worth, what they achieved, how many phase 1s, how many phase 2s, you know, how much acre, you know, full acres updating. They've got their leveraging in there, which is an awesome, if you have it, type of metric to put in there. And how much they got in not just assessment leveraging, but how much in cleanup leveraging. How many acres are ready for reuse? This is just awesome. If you can, any of this, if you can contain, you know, put that in there, whether it's a brownfield grant or something regarding accomplishments of another federal or non-federal grant, you know, just put it in there and make it look like, you know, you've achieved a lot. So brag about yourself. And they indicate that they have complied with all past work plans and schedules. and terms and conditions. So they're meeting, just stating that they haven't had any deficiencies. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back. I thought it was the same slide. It looked familiar. Sorry about that. So this is someone who has received other federal or non-federal assistance, hasn't received a brownfield grant. And they state that they haven't received a brownfield grant in the past, but they have received other assistance, whether it's federal or non-federal, in this case, federal. They were awarded a little over $500,000 from their state's revolving fund and from their drinking waters revolving fund, and from their Michigan Economic Development Corporation to reconstruct Center Street. So they talk about how much road, how much water main, how much sanitary sewer, storm sewer was was constructed, and how they leveraged pass-through federal funds, as well as obtained more than $2 million in local match. So that they did a really good job of taking what they received and getting more money out of it and leveraging dollars. And they complied with all the funding requirements. Obviously, they have a couple of, 3 different fund pots that they're dealing with. So, the fact that they actually complied with all those requirements, well, with all those moving parts, and they have, successfully had an audit conducted, and were successful on that. They had no major deficiencies, and they met with all their compliance requirements. So they did a great job. So even if you have, as I can't speak to this much because this was a really important point that was brought up during the Indiana workshop, even if you don't have, $500,000, even if you have, a smaller amount, a foundation grant, put that down and, speak to all these things. If you've leveraged funding, if you created jobs, if you've done anything that is really positive with respect to that grant, and really shown that what you got that grant for is what you really took it above and beyond. Just, brag about yourself. Next slide. And I know that there's a lot going on here, but you're not alone. Next slide. And we're here, Kansas State University tab, and we're here to help you. Next slide. And one of the first things, or first couple of things that we offer, there are a number of things we offer, and we've talked a little bit about these over the last few days, but specific to writing your grants or getting ready to write your grants, we do conduct grant proposal reviews, and we do help with strategy assistance. If you're trying to decide what are you really trying to accomplish with this grant, what are good target areas, what are good priority brownfields, those sorts of things. So, go ahead and take advantage of a second set of eyes, and let us know if you do want some assistance on reviewing that proposal, or assistance just sitting down and talking about your community and deciding a good strategy. Next slide. And as always, we want to hear your feedback. So if you could click that link when you get a chance, or on the chat if they're putting it there. And I think they also put the QR code so you can get on that with your phone. And as we've mentioned, this feedback really helps us in either doing new presentations or new workshops, and improving the workshops that we currently have. So we really value your feedback. Next slide. Okay, we're going to move on. If you were with us yesterday, we are going to do another work group, breakout work group. So all of you will be assigned and put into a work group you will have a facilitator. It's typically myself, Beth, Roxanne, and there are a few others. Not sure who's all assigned today, but someone that's going to kind of lead you through this exercise. So don't worry, you won't be just left alone. Today, we want each working group to review section 3 because the budget is a very important thing, and outlining your tasks, as Beth has gone over, is really an important part, and we want to make sure everybody has a chance to work with that. You're going to look at a successful assessment grant. As I mentioned, it is Barberton's. All of this information, I think, well, it definitely is in our resource documents. And I believe Roxanne sent that out the night before, or sent a link to that last night. You'll assign a lead from your working group. They'll report out at the end of this. You're going to review the ranking criteria for section 3, and then discuss and score it as a working group. When you review, carefully consider how well the grantee does tying their story together in their narrative. So make sure that they're, being kind of, keeping consistency. You probably reviewed either section 2 or section 1 yesterday. If you see something that stands out that isn't consistent with what you heard in those sections, that's a problem. And that will, that will be reflected in their scores. Next slide. So your main documents you'll be using, section 5, which is the narrative review information. This is what the EPA and other reviewers that are reviewing grants will use when they're conducting their reviews. Section 4 of the guidelines is also important if you have any questions, because that is the actual narrative grant language and what should be followed to a T. And again, we're looking at a last year's successful application for Barberton for community-wide assessment. Next slide. The narrative should be clear and concise. We don't like a lot of run-on sentences. Don't use a lot of buzzwords. Don't use a lot of generalized statements. What reviewers want to see is detail. What's going on in your community? What's going on at your site? How many, as we've talked about earlier, what's the percentage of unemployed if that's an issue, or what's the percentage of, people with a certain health problem, different things like that. This won't be reflected as much in section 3, but these are important things. And again, data from census and EJ screen, that's going to be a little less in section 3. Did they provide a response to all information in the grant guidelines? Make sure that that's done. And if, as Beth mentioned, they should be using the budget table. Really, you don't want to put that in narrative format. You want to use the budget table and keep it simple and give the information that EPA is asking for you. And consistency throughout the proposal is essential. These are things like if somebody mentioned in their task they're going to do something, but it's not reflected in the budget, that's an issue. So, consistency is important. Next slide. Okay, we are all going to be, you don't have to do anything, just stand there, and you're all going to be organized into groups and with a facilitator, and we're going to get started on this work group project.
All right, I think everybody is back in. If you guys want to start our report out. Beth, who did you have reporting out for your group?
Well, I just told you once already, but I was on mute. Abigail Pollock was she's our spokesperson. And Abigail, can you introduce yourself and say where you're from?
Yes. Hi, I'm Abigail Pollock, and I'm from Clean Capital. I'm a solar developer who focuses on brownfield redevelopment, and so I've been working with communities on their grants. Our group awarded full points for section 3A description, task descriptions. Under project implementation, 3A1 project implementation, we awarded full points, but we did note that the proposed community outreach with one public meeting per year might be considered a little bit skimpy. On 3A2 project schedule, we also awarded full points, but we did note that it was not a very detailed project schedule and didn't specify like a specific start date. On section 3, 3A3 project lead task activity lead, we did award full points, but noted that we wanted to make sure that the person identified in the task activity lead section was also mentioned elsewhere in the application with their qualifications. And then in section 4 outputs, we also awarded full points, but did note that for task 1, it appeared that the number of task force meetings could have been included. And we also noted that this application had like a pretty aggressive quantitative output for phase 1 and phase 2 assessments and ABCAs. Indicating that they would do 10 of all of those. And while we think that that's really great for this application, that might not be like appropriate for every application who hasn't already identified 9 of their sites. On section 3B, the cost table, we also thought this was really good and gave full points. Although we did discuss with Beth and with Kara that that it's really difficult to move funds from one category to another where there is none in the original budget. So for example, on the task for site inventory, they indicated that city staff and consultants would be traveling to potential sites as part of that inventory process, but their costs did not only included personnel hours and didn't include a line item for travel or contractual costs. And then the last section, 3C for measurement. We thought that was also really strong and gave them full points there as well, and especially indicated like the very last line where they indicated that if they don't meet a sufficient progress requirement and like gave a hard number and timeline of what that looks like, what their plan would be to address that. That's it for our team, I think.
Awesome, thank you. Amy, you want to go next?
Matt Pesci is going to talk about our work group and what we came up with. Am I able to, is it okay if I share my screen with our scores? I think I should be able to. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Matt, if you can introduce yourself real quick and then go through our scoring, that would be awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Matt Pesci, I'm a senior project manager and senior associate with Manick & Smith Group. I've been involved with US EPA grants for probably close to a decade now. We also, as Amy has up here, did section 3. And overall scored them all really well. So for 3AI, we did give them 10 out of 10 for the implementation. Thought that, they used the table format well and had good descriptions, but not too wordy. So put the information in concisely like they should. For the schedule, also gave them full points. And we did discuss, you know, there are differences between the different types of grants when you're putting together the schedule, but you know, for an assessment grant like this one was, it's okay to be somewhat vague. When you're talking about, you know, start dates for different parts of the, especially like, you know, the QAP and the assessments, you know, it's okay to put in, you know, you're gonna start it in the first quarter or second quarter. And then, but it's also, want to make sure that, you know, for things like community outreach, you mentioned that, you know, you'll start it at whatever quarter, but then it's going to continue throughout the life of the grant. And then finally, we did note they were specific where you need to be on that, when you're talking about like acres reporting, because there are specific timeframes for getting those quarterly reports in, you know, 30 days after the end of the quarter, you know, your quarterly reports are due. So they did include that specificity. Under 3A gave them full point for, you know, the task and activity leads, and noted, and this is something I personally got dinged on several years ago. You know, your site assessment tasks are obviously going to be driven by and led by your environmental consultant. So you should put that, but then you also need to add that, you know, any task that you indicate, you know, is going to be directed by or over, you know, led by your consultant, that you also need to add that extra thing and overseen by, you know, the grantee, because US EPA does want to see that. Under outputs, you know, we gave them the full points. They were again specific to the point. You know, detailing the number of different items are going to be generated. Cost estimates. Now we did ding them a point here, and I think basically related to what the previous one brought up. You know, they talked about, you know, the community outreach and programmatic support involving consultants, but like, as it was pointed out, there's no budget items for them for, you know, contractual under those two tasks. So we did ding them for that. And then finally 3C, the plan and measure progress, we gave them the full points because again, they were detailed, and they did include that that plan for, you know, if the 35% of the budget wasn't met, you know, within a certain time frame, what they were going to do about it. And that's it.
Thanks, Matt. Dan, I think you had a group.
Yes, John West will report out for us.
Yeah, so with our group, we've I'm just going to kind of go about this at a little higher level rather than diving into the specifics for like each of the plan implementation schedule and activity lead, just because of the way this was presented in that table format, and with the repetition of items for each of the major tasks. I think that there was a feeling amongst several of us that we didn't particularly like the format for the table and the repetition of each set of criteria for each of the tasks, just because when you do something like that, you tend to lose details, you tend to lose continuity, especially for things like schedule. Where are your precursors? Where are things leading? What comes next? And it's a lot harder to read that in this kind of a format. We also had a concern about what the public outreach is, the community outreach, where they are fully concentrated on just using Facebook, and then saying community meetings will be held as needed. We felt like, especially in this day and age, that you're going to need to reach more of your population, which means you're going to need to use several social media channels, not just Facebook, as well as our present cancel culture and what Facebook has done in the past, you never know if you're actually going to have that platform available to you. So you need to be more diverse anyway. So we did, as just a general thing for all of the task activities and task descriptions, we gave them 23 points instead of 25 points. For the cost estimate, we gave them the full 15 points. We didn't see the weaknesses that had been previously mentioned, which was a good catch on the other team's parts in terms of catching the descriptions of what their oversight's going to do versus what the contractor is going to do. So that was a great catch on their parts. For the plan to measure, we did dock them 1 point on that, just because they didn't keep their consistency throughout a lot of the narrative before. They were talking about Ohio VAP, Ohio Buster, what the actual phase 1, phase 2s we're going to be shooting for. And then when you get to the measuring the environmental results, everything turns into acres. And we understand that this is a US EPA grant application, but it does fail a little bit in consistency in our view. So that was our report. Thanks.
Thank you. I think our group was last. I'll share my screen. Kate Dunn is going to report out for us.
Okay, hi everyone. I am Kate Dunn, a senior planner at Buckeye Hills Regional Council. Our group gave, in the project implementation section, 3AI, we gave them a 10 out of 10. We did raise the question though, when we were discussing it, if that section, if they were a little too general, a little too generic. We thought that they could have been a little more specific about what they were going to be doing, and who's doing what. But otherwise we felt that they did what they needed to do. So we felt that they deserved full points for that. And then in section 3.2, the anticipated project schedule, we also thought that maybe they were a little too brief and that maybe they could have elaborated a little more. This is also just like a nitpicky programmatic thing, but we felt that maybe using Facebook pages was just a little too checkboxy, that type of deal, because we just feel that Facebook pages don't get a whole lot of interaction. So maybe taking a better look at what they plan to do for public participation. And we gave them a 3 on that, a 3. So I guess still full points, like they did what they needed to do. 3A3, the task activity lead. We felt that it was brief, but I mean, they did what they needed to do. So they said who's going to be handling the program, and that's what they needed to do. So we gave them a 5. 3A4, the outputs. We felt that they were a little too general in this section and that they could have elaborated a little bit more with some of their points, and what they plan to do, their final deliverables. So we gave them a 4 out of 5 in that section. Moving on to the cost estimates, 3B. We felt that they did exactly what they needed to do, what the application was asking in this section. So we did give them full points. We were a little skeptical with the no indirect costs being listed in this section, but thought maybe like attributed it down to maybe that's something with the city, and their preferences on funding. So we still gave them full points even when we brought that up in discussion. 3C, the plan to measure and evaluate environmental progress and results. We gave them full points. We gave them a full 5 points with that, because we felt that they did exactly what they were asked to do, according to the application. So overall, we gave them a 42. And that's what our group did.
Thanks, Kate. Does anyone have any residual questions or comments to make? Okay. Then we can move on to the next part.
Okay, I am going to talk again, and I want to wrap up this webinar workshop with writing a strong proposal. So we've talked about all the different sections of the grant. Hopefully you've received some tips and helpful hints when you sit down and write your own grant. And now we just want to talk a little bit about how to tie it all together. Next slide. So it's important to set the stage for your grant. This has been mentioned before, but and be consistent throughout it, but I can't say this enough. I think we're noticing that just in our work groups that people are picking up on things that may have been mentioned earlier, but just as in the in section 3, but maybe costs weren't necessarily given, recorded for that particular activity. In the same way that you may talk about a certain area that's disadvantaged in your grant, but that's not one of your target areas. You want to talk about those target areas and why they have problems, and you want to keep that consistent. So starting out in section 1, it's really important to talk about your history and challenges. I've seen a few grants where they just give a couple sentences to that. And we don't want you to go on for pages, but you do want to talk more about, hey, when did your city start, becoming, say, an industrial city, or focusing on the steel industry or certain industries? Was it when the railroad came through in 1890, whatever? Give a little background. So that's when things started. Talk a little bit about what your city is known for, what they've produced, and then talk a little bit. Often it's 1980s, but talk about what happened, a downturn, why you've got abandoned industrial and commercial sites, or and abandoned downtowns, services and things like that, and discuss those and how many jobs are lost. So, give a nice background as to why your city, why your geographic area is looking to do brownfields redevelopment. And then you want to move and drill down into your target area or areas. I think we've mentioned before, having a couple areas is good. Having a whole lot of areas, not so good, because it just gets confusing. It's hard to keep up with all of those and make sure that you're addressing all the needs for target areas. As I think you've probably seen, the grants, as you go through the different sections, ask you to speak specifically to your target area or areas. So get a couple that really, an industrial corridor, a commercial corridor, a waterfront, that are ripe for redevelopment, but are, being stalled because you have brownfields. And then most importantly, what is your affected population in that area? And you want to focus on the target area, but also if there are neighborhoods nearby and it's industry and it has historical air emissions or wastewater emissions and things like that, you can talk about that as well, but stick it to in and around the target area. And how are they affected? Joblessness, poverty, different health problems, things like that. We've got EJ Screen, and Riley went over it, did a really nice job. And so there's a lot of data. You can get through that. And we also have some other resources for you as well. And I'll talk about one of them in a minute. And then you're going to talk about your assessment and cleanup activities. Remember, with cleanup, you need to talk about some of the upfront work you're you've done, which includes having an APCA, developing an APCA, having a public meeting, allowing for your community to be at the public meeting and to comment on that APCA and understand that. And those are sorts of things that are threshold criteria and you absolutely need to do. So make sure that those are included, as well as any details that you have about what you're going to do, assessment, cleanup, rise in your target areas. And then finally, your positive impacts. We cover that in section 2, but there are other areas where you'll discuss your positive impacts and reduction of identified threats. And we did have a couple questions in the chat about how to address that with an assessment. One of the ways, it's not the only way, but one of the ways is to say, when you're talking about health issues or other issues, EJ issues, that the assessment grants are going to help because they're going to identify and confirm the existence or non-existence of different contaminants that might be causing these health effects. Particularly with cleanup, job creation is a good one to talk about, as well as eliminating threats through either cleaning up, removing soil or groundwater, or treating it, or putting barriers up as far as engineering controls. Next slide. So here's a nice example of, a project and how you would look at these different bubbles, so to speak. So you've got a city that, because of its history, has lack of business opportunities. There's been job loss over the years, and a failed industrial legacy. This speaks a lot to Barberton, actually. Health and environmental impacts from a poor economy, high unemployment, they have that in their target area. Contamination issues, there's very likely contamination in the target areas around them. And they have, certain sites. In this case, an abandoned manufacturing site is their priority site. You can choose more than one, but again, like target areas, don't choose too many so that you get mixed up and don't give details about each of the sites as you go through the grant. Cleanup and redevelopment of this manufacturing site into business incubator would save the economy and improve health and welfare of residents. So it leads to creating jobs. It leads to identifying what the contaminants are and how those might be addressed in the future. Next slide. So certain pitfalls, things that some of us that have done grant reviews for Kansas State have seen, waiting until the guidelines come out to do your grant planning or grant project. Your community or the community you're working with, and what's their problem? That you're going to need, the history, the areas that you want to address, or areas that have problems. So look through the last year's grant guidelines for the type of grant you want, and look at these things and get a good sense of what information you're going to have to gather. Hopefully this workshop has helped with that too, but don't wait until the grant guidelines come out, because then you're going to be, limited for time, under pressure, and, it makes it hard to write a good grant that way. I've already talked about the downfalls of selecting too many priority areas or target areas or priority projects. So just, hone in on a few, one or two. Using a priority project where assessment or cleanup doesn't address the impacted population or problems or their health statistics. So you want to make sure that what you're addressing as a priority, which will be within your target area, is going to help what health problems that you may have found through EJ screen or other data, and other problems that like high poverty, low and high unemployment. Writing too much up front and not saving room for other areas where points are usually lost. So, strong on the detail. Don't spend time with buzzwords, buzz paragraphs, those sorts of things that are more general. They don't want to hear it. They want the details. That's what the reviewers are looking for, and that's what they're scoring on. And ignoring notes in section 5. We talked about, using that. We did use that as we reviewed our different sections of the grant over the last couple of days in the work groups. And here's an example. If the inability to draw on other initial sources of funding, it's not because the community has a small population or is low income, then you'll only receive 2 of 5 maximum points. Losing 3 points is huge. And there are a couple more examples, or if you look at section 5, you will see where this is mentioned. And it typically is also mentioned in section 4, the actual grant narrative guidelines. Non-cohesive story. Obviously, we've talked about that. You want to make sure your story makes sense. It goes from A to B, and it kind of follows that outline or bubbles as to telling your story and getting your points across. And incomplete response to criteria. So just read the guidelines carefully. Every response or every subsection, every question has a response. Earlier on with grants, sometimes NA or non-applicable was okay, but that I have heard from EPA reviewers that is not the case anymore. Next slide. So do your homework. And your resources in the resource tab for this webinar workshop where you registered, take a look at those resources. There's an information resource for brownfield grant writers. It will give you all kinds of different web links to different types of census data, Department of Labor data, and we talked a little bit, I think Beth mentioned the toxic data, which is ATSDR. So there's a lot of good information there that you can get to and hopefully will help you in preparing a really good grant application. Look at your health departments. Ohio does have, the state of Ohio has a really good database or access to their data through that link. It's also on that information for resources. Local hospital reports. Oftentimes it's hard to get health data within, drilling down finer than county level. Sometimes it's just by county in some areas, and especially in some of your more rural areas. But if you have a nearby hospital, they have done studies. So they're going to know what the issues are in the community because they need to make their own plans as to, supplies they need, doctors they need, nurses they need, what the specialties are they need. So they're going to have that data, and they generally are going to be able to share that with you. Community Action Agency reports will also give you information, as well as so different needs that are in the community. Documentation about blight in tax increment financing districts. If you're within a TIF, you can get that information and talk a little bit about the blight in your area. Maybe you can look at things like safety issues along with health issues, particularly if you have abandoned buildings that youth are getting into, or crimes are being committed, things like that. All good information to include in your grant. And there's some municipal documents that are out. Transportation and planning departments, they usually have inventories of sidewalk existence and their condition, ADA compliance. That's something that they have to speak to and report on. And Parks and Rec will have an inventory that identifies neighborhoods that are underserved with access. So green space is another thing you can talk about, particularly if you are looking to have a green space option. for some of your priority brownfields, or quite often people will redevelop them that will have a commercial or mixed use building, and then they'll have green space or a connection to a bike path. So those are ways to say, hey, this is really needed. We don't have it around here. Some of the police departments will have crime reports, so that's always a good one to take a look at. And speak to the problems in your target area or areas. Next slide. And Beth gave us a very nice overview of the KSU tab. And there you get on our tab website and you can see on that first slide, Tab Easy is really easy to access. You can access past successful grants. Also above that Tab Easy, there's a Brownfields inventory tool if you are starting an inventory or you're working to update it. That might be helpful for you. Take a look at it, and if it is and you have questions, Roxanne, Beth, or I can get you started on that and point you in the right directions, and you may find this to be a really helpful tool if you are considering using some of your grant for inventory creation or updating. Also, don't forget, we've mentioned a few times that we do reviews of draft grant applications at KSU tab. Next slide. So our application review, it provides reviews and suggestions. Most of us use the edit and review under Word, and we'll give you all kinds of comments and some suggested edits. So hopefully it's easy to follow, and sometimes I'll put links in there if I think you've got, and I know others do as well, if there's data that you might want to add to a section that you might not know about. So it's a good service, I think. I mean, obviously I provide some of it, so I'm going to say that, but no, it is really helpful. Do schedule in advance. It does take us about 3 to 5 days to turn around. Obviously, as we get closer to the deadline, more people are asking for that. So the earlier reviews, so the earlier that you get them into us, the better. And as this last bullet says, you can, if you get them in early, we can even provide a second review. We do that. We've done that. And it's certainly available and could be very helpful to you. And just to mention, extra set of eyes is always good. Even if you're using a consultant, everybody's going to look at things a different way and see different details that could be improved or may need to be removed or may have been missed. So definitely consider this and hopefully it will help you. Next slide. Next steps and key milestones. So assessment grant funding, we want to make sure that you're eligible as an applicant. For coalition applicants, you got to make sure that you've got a lead applicant that meets that definition. Carla talked about that yesterday. And also that your members are eligible as well. And you will have to establish a memorandum of agreement amongst the group so you know who's doing what and who's leading what with respect to this grant. Identify priority sites, as we mentioned, and work to secure access. Sometimes that's easier said than done, so get that done early if you can. Establish a reuse plan. That's something TAP can help with if you have problems. And engage the public. Engaging the public is going to help you in identifying good sites, identifying areas that might need to be looked at, and also what kind of reuse they may want to see. So, work with your community. It can be a big help in many cases. There's some information on the right side of the slide regarding grants.gov. We've talked about this before, but do take a look at that. That's something that you want to make sure that you've got that kind of set up. You know who your person that's going to sign off on it, the AOR, so you don't run into any trouble with it at the 9th hour. Or I should say 11th hour. Now if you are looking, and as we've talked about more yesterday, and you say, hey, I'm not ready as a community to do this at this point with a US EPA grant, there are state or federal targeted brownfield assessments. Dan talked about this in detail this morning. Contact Dan. There's also, sometimes they can do larger assessments at the US EPA level, and Melanie Sorman is the contact. Next slide. Cleanup funding, determining grant, the applicant eligibility, but even more important, the site eligibility. This can get complicated. Look at last year's grant guidelines. If you have questions, contact US EPA. There is a contact at the end of the FY24 guidelines for Region 5. Even if they're not the contact for this year, they'll be able to pass you on. Oftentimes you do need EPA's help in establishing that. And you can also talk to Ohio EPA. They're going to be able to find out or know already if there's enforcement actions that might cause some eligibility problems. You have to have a solid reuse plan. If you have a developer on board, if you have someone that's willing to expand or move their company to the site, that's going to make you a better applicant, a more competitive applicant. So, make sure that you know what you're going to be doing at the end of the day. Yeah, the reviewers are looking for that. And as I mentioned before, start drafting your APCA. There's a lot of APCA examples at this web link. So take a look at them. It should help you quite a bit as you move forward with that, but get that started now. Revolving Loan Fund Grant, as Carla said, these are a little more complex for typically states or regional entities, but they're going to need to make sure they're applicable or eligible as an applicant, as well as coalition members if they're doing a coalition. They have to develop marketing strategies and discuss and come up with a plan for revolving their loan. Next slide. And that's it. And as far as Ohio, Roxanne, who's our regional director for Region 5, Beth Grigsby, who's our assistant regional director for this region, and myself, who's the Ohio point of contact. Thank you for sticking out, participating in this. Hopefully you got a lot of good information, and that's our contact information. We're there if you need us. Don't hesitate to call or email, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Amy. If you have not already, if you could hop on and fill out the survey for today, we'd really appreciate it. Again, this helps us provide good programming moving forward. And then if there are any other questions, we do have a few more minutes in the chat box. You can leave those there now and we can go over them. Otherwise, have an excellent rest of your day.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there any information on whether this infrastructure law, which gave the EPA, expanded budget for these grants, is there any indication that that will occur again, or because I know it ends after fiscal year 26, and I was just wondering what you guys have collected or found out.
Sure. Is Carla still on? I wasn't sure if she is.
I know she had to get off. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't really answer that just because obviously it's for federal, but from what it's been indicated, I don't think that they anticipate it being re-upped in 2026. So at least as of right now. But
Okay.
actually, no, I'm not really the right person to answer that, but
No, no worries. Thank you.
yeah. Anybody else? All right.
Somebody has a question as to whether Barberton used the Tab EZ tool for their application. Because I did not review theirs. Not sure if they did or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I know in Region 5, we had a pretty high success rate though for folks that did use Tab Easy, but also if they had us review their grant, that seemed to be very, very helpful. But yeah, I really don't know if Barberton did or not.
All right. Well, everyone, have a great rest of your week, and thank you again for joining us.